Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies after a great talk by the 25th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Admiral Paul Zukunft. Sir, thanks very much for joining us. Fantastic comments up there.
Well, Vago, thanks, and it's great to see that many people in the audience interested in the Arctic. If it was just you and I, well, I'd still feel pretty good because you were there, but no, we had a full house today. It was great.
It really is an auspicious time to be having this meeting. Arctic Coast Guards Forum, last week met in Boston. You guys had a great agreement. I want to talk about that. More specifically, later this week, the United States hands over, just in a couple of days, the United States hands over its two-year chairmanship of the Arctic Council. It's going to go to Finland. I was talking to a DoD friend of mine, and there was a little bit of questioning about the Arctic, the climate change up there, the sense that there is going to be more trade. And so there was this thing of, well, it's not, people may not be racing up there. We don't think, may not think that this is a big deal. What are the changes that you've been observing? You and I talked right after you'd gotten back from Greenland, where you'd seen the glacier melt, firsthand. Talk to us a little bit about what's happening up there and why it matters and why folks in Washington and Americans in general should care about what's happening up in the Arctic.
Well, I'd just go back not too far in the distant past, where the Arctic was nothing more than an ice field, and our submarine fleet would traverse under it. Well, the ice has retreated, and now we have ships operating on the surface. Some of those with military intent, but we have this ocean that is now opened up. But it's opened up into what I would consider, a little bit of a strategic no man's land. What does it really mean now that these waters have opened up? We have a military that is stretched far and wide as we look at our national military strategy. And quite honestly, it would not be the first place I would put DoD assets. What authorities do you need to operate in the Arctic as well? And you start looking at a military service with this compendium of authorities that we have in the United States Coast Guard, which has been operating up there almost since the acquisition of the Alaska Territory in 1867. So I really see this first and foremost as a Coast Guard domain, and then Coast Guard under our Department of Homeland Security. And I think because of the many other alarms that are sounding in the Department of Defense right now.
And you also have, as the water warms, the ice melts, fish are going further up, so that's going to draw, you made this great point about how many people depend on fish and why there's going to be a run up in that region. There are cruise ships that are going to go back. There's a terrifying image you put up there of the Crystal Serenity as seen through an ice field, and when you recognize that's a giant ship with a very thin hull, they better be doing some good navigation. What are the shortcoming of resources up there? You mentioned that you're going to be heading out on the International Ice Patrol that started after the Titanic sank, and here it is more than 100 years later, and the Coast Guard is still, and as part of an international team, still doing that mission. What's at stake if one of these ships, or an oil exploration vessel, or God forbid, a large cruise ship like that, hits the ice and is damaged?
Well, we saw during the sinking of the Titanic, shortly thereafter, the Carpathia arrived, and every person on that ship would have perished had not the Carpathia been there. We don't have a Carpathia right now. Whether it's a commercial ship or whether it's a Coast Guard ship or whether it's a military ship, if Crystal Serenity should have a horrific event such as that, and there would be a significant loss of life should that occur. You don't have, even if you can evacuate those people, there's no trauma center. You're talking thousands of miles away if you need to evacuate someone for high-level medical care. That doesn't exist up there as well. It is a very austere environment to begin with, and the shore infrastructure just isn't there. Your best investment in infrastructure, quite honestly, is probably going to be at sea.
You mentioned that it's about 20 people that you can help, not even thousands or hundreds of people, right? I mean, the infrastructure right now, when you come to rescuing people, is just a handful or dozens of folks.
Well, that was in Nome, Alaska. And Nome is a fairly modern village in Alaska, but we wanted to stress their emergency response capability and our national capability as well. We were going to have 200 simulated Boy Scouts, volunteers, and the like to be victims of a cruise ship that sank, hypothermic and the like. And the mayor said, we don't need 200 to stress the system. 20 would overwhelm us. So there you go.
That's extraordinary. As you look, let's talk about native peoples for a second, because the Coast Guard really, when Healy goes up there or Coast Guard ships go up into that region, you guys are seeing dramatic changes happening. You had an image of historic villages that are on islands that have been there for a millennia, but now there's shore erosion because there isn't sea ice. What are some of the challenges that you guys are going to have to respond to up in that area as these sorts of tectonic events that, I mean, you made a joke that one of these communities who's lived there for thousands of years is literally voting itself off the island and trying to go to a new place. What are some of the challenges you guys are going to face up there?
I think just, the ability to get there in a timely manner. So if you have this coastal erosion taking place, and if it's severe enough, I'll use Katrina as an example. We had, probably 30, 40 helicopters arrive on scene. As soon as that hurricane cleared, we were there. And there was a good constellation of higher level treatment centers that we could evacuate those people to. So if you have a natural disaster up in the high latitudes, we are resource constrained and also shore infrastructure constrained as well if it's going to require a medical evacuation. Bigger challenge if you have First Nations that now need to reestablish sovereignty. Not a Coast Guard mission, but a concern as well. We do a lot of outreach with the First Nations up in the North Slope as well. Very sensitive to subsistence living. If there's offshore drilling that might cause whales to disperse and they rely on those whales to maintain their way of life, I want to make sure that we're striking a balance between the villagers and those who are increasing activity up in that region.
You've talked about a lot of things, climate. You have a very integrated view of the challenges that are up there, food security being one of them, again, territorial, the people piece of it, the economic piece of it that you mind. The incoming administration has been a little bit critical of climate change and a couple of other factors, the importance of opening up fields to drilling. You made a great point about economically. Right now it doesn't make sense, but very soon, near future, that could change. What's, in your view, as the senior sort of maritime advisor to the president, to the administration, what's the kind of integrated strategy you think the nation needs in the Arctic that brings all of these disparate pieces together to the U.S. advantage at a time when that area is becoming more competitive, even with the nation as close of an ally with us as Canada?
I think we've seen a good trial balloon with the recent executive order that would potentially open up the Arctic to offshore drilling. Much of that is under the auspices of the Department of Interior, and we have a long-standing relationship with the Department of Interior to go forth in the Arctic in a collaborative way. If I were to look back, we work closely with Shell, looking at contingency plans for a worst-case discharge. But at the same time, they were frustrated with every time they thought they were meeting policy requirements, a new policy would be laid on top of it. And so they're trying to be responsible, yet at the same time, the ground rules would change every time they got closer and closer, and eventually they lost interest. And so what the executive order can do is provide more predictability to the oil and gas industry, working with the Department of Interior, but we have a key role in that as well. And that is a natural, ongoing relationship. We have memorandums of agreement that are already stood up. So I probably don't need, a White House policy to tell me to work with the Interior. We're already doing that today.
But what about in terms of sort of a broader Arctic strategy, as you're looking at it, that brings together the maritime security piece, the food, the climate, all of these bits together? What's the advice that you would have for the president, for example, if you spend a couple of minutes talking to him when he's over at the academy for graduation soon?
Yeah. Well, I think the president understands is that you cannot be an influencer from afar. And as the United States, and we are the greatest nation on the face of this earth. But if we cannot make a very modest investment to have presence in the Arctic, that we're just going to paper the Arctic with policy, but not actually populate the Arctic with presence, then he realizes that paper is just veneer, that is not a symbol of U.S. power. And believe it or not, an icebreaker is a symbol of U.S. power in the Arctic.
I want to get to that in a minute because you made a very profound and important statement in there, among others. But I want to take you to the Arctic Coast Guards Forum. You guys got together in Boston last week. You signed a very, very important collaborative agreement setting up sort of rules of the world. Tell us why that agreement was important, why that agreement is important, and what does it concretely do?
We accelerated the timeline on this Arctic Coast Guard Forum because we want to get all of this done during our chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We agreed that whoever's chairing the Arctic Council will also chair the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And what we recognized that there was a dearth of leadership in the Arctic when it comes to actually carrying out policy that comes out of the Arctic Council. We took it upon ourselves is let's fill this leadership vacuum right here and now with our counterparts. And they all arrived at the principal level. They didn't send their second, third tier substitutes. And to me, that signified that this area is strategically important to us as well. And we look at all the challenges up there. No one nation can do it alone. And Russia clearly has to be at the table with us because when it comes to capacity, they have got it in spades with their fleet of icebreakers.
That is very interesting because if you look at the Russia relationship, on the one hand, it's very successful and very productive with you and your counterpart, the general who heads their version of the Coast Guard, their border service. But on the other hand, you also rang a potential alarm bell, given that Russia, for example, is going to start fielding Arctic ice-hardened corvettes that will also have a cruise missile capability on them. I think, as usual in a Russian way, not very subtle. Talk to us about where the relationship is very, very good. Let's talk about the positive first.
Yeah, certainly good with the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, and we share information real time. We had a tactical case last week. Russia alerted us to a ship. We boarded it, reported back to Russia. No wrongdoing on their part. If it was, we would have taken enforcement action, but kept Russia involved. I mean, a back-to-back real-time conversation with Russia there. Arctic Coast Guard Forum, they were key partners in signing these operating guidelines and building upon the inertia that was developed under the Arctic Council. They too realized that the Arctic Council, at the end of that ministerial, now what? And what's next? And so they've been very, very collaborative and collegial in that effort.
In terms of the potential threat, you said for the first time that you think that the new heavy icebreakers that we're building, which are going to be key to presence, as you said, icebreakers are presence, should have space, weight, and power in order to be able to handle weapons, and that's a little bit of a change. Why is that important from your standpoint, and what kind of weapons capability do you think that these ships should have in a worst-case sort of scenario for the future?
Yeah. Again, the space weight power piece is absolutely critical. These are platforms that will serve our nation for at least the next 30 years. What is the world going to look like 30 years from now? Quite honestly, I don't think we can predict out 5 years. But if we don't provide some flex and capability of what might the Arctic, and unfortunately, if it does become our next military campaign, how do we get there immediately? And if you don't have gray ships to do it, maybe you do it with red ships. They're still U.S. warships, and we need to turn them into warships. Then we need to look at what is in our munitions arsenal that would best fit in the Arctic. Can you put it on there in a portable fashion? That is something that you add on because of the threats changed, and it's something that you can remove as well. But if you're not building in that flex up front, we are not ready for what could turn into a worst-case scenario up in the Arctic, becoming a militarized Arctic at that.
Let me ask you about the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. The United States hasn't approved it. One of the points that you made is you're the only Arctic nation that hasn't approved it. And China, you made a good point, their icebreaker is right on the line of U.S. waters all the time to show that presence. What's your advice to this administration? How important is the United States ratifying UNCLOS in the Arctic relationship alone from your standpoint?
Yeah. Certainly we've had numerous opportunities with previous administrations to take a look at the Law of the Sea Convention, and this goes back to 1986 to present day, and we still haven't crossed that finish line. But we're starting to see the world change, and it's changing probably at the fastest rate right now up in the Arctic. As sea ice retreats and human activity, much of it commercial activity, is filling that void. Meanwhile, we've got this area the size of the state of Texas, and there is oil, gas, mineral deposits on that seafloor that may become exposed to global commons if we don't lay claim to it.
Your staff is about to give me the hook, so I'm going to give you two very, very quick questions. First one is, there is a lot of discussion about border walls. The administration has certainly put a lot of focus on the security of the nation's borders. How does the Coast Guard fit into that piece of it? Because there hasn't been as much of a public discussion on that.
You've heard from our secretary, and I would just echo his sentiments. For any campaign, you need a good defense and you need a good offense. So a wall would be part of the defensive. It's a goal line defense. But how do you go on the offense? And when you look at illicit activity destined for the United States, most of it's moving by water. And what's on the water, we have over 40 bilateral agreements where I can go right up into the waters, territorial waters, sovereign waters of other countries, take enforcement action to include deadly force and stop these shipments and apprehend these people before they carry out their delivery. Then they're extradited to the United States. 585 TCOs, Transnational Criminal Organization members, extradited, handed off to our Department of Justice with a 100% prosecution rate at the end of the day. So when I look at the executive order that goes after transnational criminal activity, much of this is an away game first. And if you want to play the away game, you need to do it offensively. And if something gets through that net, then what's your defense? So you need, as much as you might need a good defense, you've got a pretty good offense. You just don't have enough of it right now.
And you need more of it. Let me ask you one last question on the budget. You had a near-death budget experience recently. Where are you going to fall on the budget? Do you have enough money to do what you have to do? And are you going to start that buoy tender, inland buoy tender program that is so important to you, the 35 ships that guarantee $4.7 billion of trade in America's inland waterways?
Yeah, well, certainly when it becomes law, when the bill is finally signed for the 17 budget, I am very pleased with what I'm seeing in the 17 budget. It does get polar icebreakers out of the starting block. It provides a nudge forward for our inland fleet, which is better than being stuck in the starting block. So it gets us in that ready position. So I'm very optimistic about that. Our annualized operating and maintenance funding, what we call our OE account, we're still skimming just below the surface of the BCA funding levels. So I'll need to continue to work that piece as well, but it does bring in cyber as a program of record. This Congress has signaled to this administration that we must invest in our Coast Guard. So I am certainly beholding to their work in our 17 budget, and we'll continue to work the 18 budget.
Admiral Paul Zukunft, Coast Guard Commandant, sir, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Vago. Good to see you again. Okay.